Thank you for joining us for our first general listening session on the modernization of the Community Reinvestment Act. My name is Samantha Porter. I'm the Community Engagement Advisor and Outreach Manager of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our event today. Before we get started, I'd like to share just a few reminders. This event, as you may know, is meant to provide you with an overview of the ANPR and to answer clarifying questions. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. All questions will be collected via the chat function, so please note that when you're submitting your questions, you must select all panelists to ensure that we can share this information with the presenter. There will be time dedicated to the end of today's webinar to address all of the submitted questions. And if there are any that we can't get to, we will be providing a follow-up. We will not be collecting substantive feedback during today's session. Rather, we will provide information on how to submit public comment and, again, an overview of the ANPR. Also, this event is being recorded. We will provide a link to the recording as soon as possible, and we hope that you'll share it with your colleagues and stakeholders in your community. Finally, we're hosting another webinar event with the same information you'll hear today. It'll be on Wednesday, January 27th from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. So please feel free to share those event details with stakeholders in your network. And if you're having any technical difficulties, we do provide you with a phone number. For WebEx, you can dial in. We hope that you'll be able to get some technical assistance. And with that, I'd like to begin our program and introduce Anjanette Kitchline, our Assistant Vice President of Supervision, Regulation, and Credit.
Thank you very much, Samantha, and welcome to all of our attendees. On September 21st, 2020, the Board of Governors issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, or ANPR, on an approach to modernize the regulations that implement the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA. CRA reform is a key priority for the Federal Reserve, and as we consider the first major update to this rule in just about 25 years, it's really important that the reform is done thoughtfully and carefully. So the Federal Reserve has worked extensively with the FDIC and the OCC up to this point, and we're committed to work with the other agencies moving forward as well. The ANPR seeks to provide a foundation for the agencies to continue our analysis and to converge upon a consistent regulatory approach that has stakeholder approval. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia is offering today's webinar in order to provide an overview of the proposed changes to the rules and to provide you with information about how you can submit your feedback as an official public comment. We recognize that this rule is of interest to many stakeholders, including banks, government agencies, and community groups, as well as others. And of course, submitting a public comment is a vital component of the process. So we do hope that you'll consider submitting a comment to make your voice heard. We'll mention this throughout the presentation, but the 120-day public comment period will officially end on Tuesday, February 16th, 2021. So right now, I'm happy to introduce Micah Spector, who is going to provide you with an overview of the ANPR. Micah is a team manager here at the Reserve Bank and is very well versed in CRA. So Micah, please take it away.
Great. Thanks, Ange, and thanks, Samantha. And first off, thank you, everyone, for joining and taking time this afternoon to learn a little bit more about the CRA ANPR. This is going to be an overview. So I'm going to try to keep it relatively high level with the expectation. Maybe I'm not going to get into the weeds, but maybe I'll get down to some trees at a couple of points just to provide some clarity. As Samantha said, if you do have questions, and I hope there are questions, please submit them through the chat function to the presenters. Sam and I will get them at the end of the presentation. Hopefully we can get through all of them. And that's a good opportunity for someone to say, hey, I've got a clarifying question. If you want to get into a weeds back then, great, let's do that. If you've got a general question, you can do that then. If you've got an idea for how to improve CRA, as Samantha said, the right venue for that will be to submit a comment. as opposed to submitting a question to us. We'll cover a little bit the mechanisms by which one can submit a comment. I will mention at least 3 more times the importance of supplying comments to the CRA ANPR is very much part of the process. The Federal Reserve is very thoughtful, and there are a lot of bright people, but we do not have a monopoly on good ideas. We know that there are tons of great ideas related to CRA and its improvements out there amongst you, so please do comment. That will just be helpful for everybody. Rough outline of this next section, I'm going to cover a little bit about the ANPR, the objectives of modernization, and then go, again, not weeds, but maybe trees on a couple of areas and changes, and then some Q&A. So as Ange mentioned, the Board of Governors issued an ANPR. It was officially posted in the Fed Register on October 19th. The comments are due Tuesday, February 16th, 2020. This is not the last step in the CRA process. This is probably one of the first steps. So just a little big picture expectation, what's going to happen. This is the ANPR. There are comments, then the Federal Reserve Board will read every comment, every single comment. I guarantee will be read by numerous people. And then we will internally decide, hey, this makes sense. This goes with our data-driven transparency goals. Let's try to incorporate this, or like, we considered this, but we went a different way on that. And then we will release a proposed notice of rulemaking. And then historically, there has been another comment period then, like, hey, we made some changes. What's going on here? What about this? What are final tweaks? And then we will release the final rule. So as Ange said, the Federal Reserve is committed to getting this done right, which takes time and it takes input. Might not be the fastest process, but again, the goal is getting it right ideally together. So some of the objectives of CRA modernization is, big picture, to make CRA a little bit better. When it was first passed in 1977, the goal was to, combat institutional racism, discrimination, and wealth inequality. And while positive steps have been made due to CRA in the past 40-some years, those all still exist, unfortunately. So this is a great time to look at ways to improve CRA, to make it a little fairer, a little clearer, a little more approachable, and a little bit better, especially with everything going on now, COVID, coronavirus issues and recovery from that, as well as the ongoing dialogue related to racial injustice. Another key goal of the modernization process, the second last bulletin, unsurprisingly, it is a good point. The comments are due 2021, not last year, 2020. That's one of those things, and maybe we didn't think 2020 would actually end, so we didn't quite update that. It turns out it did, so we're moving forward with that. As I was saying, when CRA was first passed in 1977, and even when it was last updated just like significantly, which was 1995, there's been a lot of changes to how we bank, how bankers reach customers, how customers interact with banks, specifically the cell phone, the smartphone, using the internet, mobile banking, internet banking, didn't exist back then, and it is a significant change to how credit needs are known about and met. So there is a hope that we can try to address that now to help modernize CRA. Clarity, transparency, consistency are all goals of CRA. As an examiner, I help a team of examiners who conduct CRA performance evaluations. We recognize that it's a challenging regulation to meet. There's a lot of data required. There's a lot of subjectivity, and there are areas that can be improved. This ANPR is an attempt to address some of those. Ideally, not without having too much more of a burden on banks. We also mentioned that there are numerous stakeholders to CRA. There's banks, there's regulators, but there's also academics, there's nonprofits, there's government agencies. Each kind of looks at CRA from a different lens. So if there's things that can help you and maybe don't negatively impact or aren't too much of a burden to other groups, that's a net positive. If there are things that are going to benefit your group, please let us know, again, through the comment process. Second time I brought it up, probably at least 2 more. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we are one of 3 regulators that conduct CRA evaluations. It's us, the FDIC, and the OCC. The hope of this process is that all the agencies will get a foundation to converge and come together on and agree upon these changes to the CRA process. As it stands now, the OCC has kind of created its own framework, which will be implemented. It's currently live, but it's going to impact banks starting next year. But the hope is, we can have more dialogue. All 3 regulators were involved in the OCC's process. All 3 regulators are going to be involved in this process as well. Not exactly sure how it will all shake out, but the hope is, to converge on ideas just from the sake of fairness and consistency to all impacted parties. So with that, I'm actually going to dive in a little bit and talk about some of the items in the ANPR, starting with assessment areas. For those who are not as familiar, an assessment area is the geographic area that a bank is intending to meet the credit needs of. It consists of what are considered whole geographies, which are often counties, but can be MSAs, which are metropolitan statistical areas, combinations of counties. It can also be as small as individual census tracts. Anything smaller than that isn't necessarily considered a whole geography. Generally, a bank's assessment area is where it has branches. It's historically what it's been, and lots of commentary kind of in our process that, hey, we don't want to get away from the importance of branches. Branches are an essential part of CRA process. That is an area the bank is, they've got branches in the area, they're taking deposits from the area, they're ideally making loans in that area. So that is very much staying. Some areas where the ANPR is asking questions is, well, what if it's not a branch? What if it's a LPO, a loan production office, or a deposit taken ATM? Then should it be included? Should it not? Another issue as far as modernization that the ANPR is trying to get at is the internet banking space. There are a number of institutions that have national footprints. They can make loans in any state. They can take deposits from anywhere. But they've got one brick and mortar headquarters, and maybe it's in Salt Lake City, maybe it's in Wilmington. So under the old CRA rules, interestingly, they can take deposits from anywhere. They can take loans from anywhere. But the only assessment area they had is where they had that headquarters, their one branch. So they might only be meeting the credit needs in Salt Lake City or in Wilmington. That's something, the ANPR is trying to address. Like that doesn't make sense. If they're taking loans from everywhere and taking deposits from everywhere, maybe there should be a nationwide assessment area for internet banks. And credit the ANPR if you haven't spent much time leafing through it yet. There are some questions where the board is proposing, hey, this is a proposal. We've got data backing up why we think this way, where we're coming from, and why we came to this conclusion. There are also questions where the board is asking, we're not sure what makes sense here. We don't know what a definition of an internet bank might be. We might not know, what a nationwide assessment area, the nuts and bolts of it might look like. So we're asking questions and really hoping to get comments 3 times, on what you think is fair and what makes sense. So this is an area where, we want to improve, we want to do better. We welcome all thoughts and feedback. The overall evaluation framework of a performance evaluation of CRA is going to shift a little bit, and it is going to focus based on size and business model. There are currently a number of methodologies that CRA can follow, largely based on asset size. That is going to continue. There will be, if you're a large bank, definition of a large bank might shift a little bit, trying to figure out what makes sense here. Again, the Fed is like, hey, a large bank, it's currently about $1.3 billion. It was $1.1 billion, and then it went up for inflation since '95. Should it be $750 million? Should it be $1 billion? Should it be $2 billion? Again, the Fed is asking questions and for input here, just as far as what makes sense. So if you are a large bank, which is potentially over $1 billion, there will be 2 tests you will need to follow. We'll talk about a little on the next slide. If you are a small bank under that threshold, you might have to meet just one sub-test of that. There was one methodology called the Intermediate Small Bank, the ISB, which was for something smaller than a large bank, bigger than a small bank, obviously. And that will be going away. It'll just be small retail and large retail. a wholesale limited purpose will still exist, and a strategic plan, CRA, will still exist as well. So this is one of those times where I'm going to get into the trees a little bit, talking about what the new framework will look like for a large retail bank. There will be 2 tests, each with 2 subtests. From a big picture perspective, it's not too different what we're looking at than the way evaluations currently go. For a large bank, there used to be 3 tests. Now they're kind of taking parts of each one and moving them into the 4 subtests. The way we evaluate and what is included in each other is getting expanded and teased out a little bit. That's through the ANPR process. But generally, it's not a world shift in terms of what we're going to look at. What we as examiners, what banks are expected to do, what community groups are interested in, is not going to shift significantly. When it comes to retail lending, one thing that we heard a lot from banks is, how much CRA lending do I need to do? How much lending in low and moderate income geographies do I need? How much to low and moderate income families? How much to small businesses? And classic examiner answer was always, it depends. Depends on, the performance context of the area, the bank's capacity, and the opportunities to commit in that area. We recognize that it depends is not particularly clear. So we are trying to address that. We are intending to create metric-based thresholds, which will say, hey, if you are lending this percent in LMI geographies and this percent to LMI families and this percent to small businesses, that's good. Those metrics, we looked at those metrics. There's a presumption of satisfactory there. We can be comfortable with that. We're going to compare the bank's performance the same way we currently do to different benchmarks, a community benchmark and a market benchmark, saying like, hey, this is what other peers in your area are doing, and this is what kind of the opportunity for credit needs in the area are. And if you're, in that ballpark and looking better than that, that's going to be metric-based satisfactory. We are also planning on rolling out a dashboard. So if you are a bank, you can figure out how you're doing currently. So you don't have to wait and see, we've got an exam coming up. So let's see how we look let's see how the examiners say we're doing. There's going to be a dashboard available to you as a bank. You can input your HMDA data and be like, hey, this is where you stand in relation to those benchmarks. So that is, one of the goals of transparency. So the bank will kind of understand what it's doing. Those are both, quantitative. One of the keys of CRA as it currently exists is there's lots of qualitative measures. And we don't want to lose that. That's something we heard from community groups throughout the process. We don't want to lose those qualitative aspects because they're so important, and they're going to still exist. In the retail services, they will exist both for services that it offers in the retail services side, as well as in part of the community development financing subtest and the community development services subtest as well. The retail services subtest, I talked about lending a little bit. Service is going to look at deposit products and delivery systems, which is something that I'm hoping for some good dialogue, some interesting, thoughtful comments here. What currently happens, what we've seen nationwide is branches are decreasing. Some of it's the impact of COVID, the ability and interest in going places in person, but some of it is also obviously attributed to the uptick in internet banking and mobile banking. Branches are going down. So bankers will say, hey, we might be closing this branch, but, lots of people are using our mobile apps to, get loans and make deposits. That's how we're serving low, moderate income individuals in the area. And there's currently a need for better data in this space. We are unsure what data bankers have available or researchers have available to help prove, hey, as the branch went away, this percentage of LMI individuals or geographies are using our apps. This is an area, where the board's asking questions to figure out what makes sense. How can we help prove that, LMI people and their credit needs are being met through mobile services? Community development financing is largely similar to the investments test plus community development loans. They'll be lumped together. In addition to we're going to create metrics based on community development. Hey, how much should I be doing? Again, bankers always ask, how much CD loans do I need? How much CD investments do I need? It depends, not super clear. We're coming up with metrics and benchmarks. Here, data is a little less clear. So there are some proposals in the ANPR based on deposit size, seeing kind of what makes sense. And we don't want to lose the qualitative aspect, so it's not just dollars. We are proposing something called an impact score. So a community development loan or investment that is very local and very impactful, we don't want to lose that, so we will rate things. Proposals currently a 1 to 3, with more impactful community development activities receiving a higher impact score. This way, again, transparency, much clearer about what our expectations are. And as far as the services subtest, this is, as it currently exists in the current services test, volunteerism involvement in the community. And there are some expansions rather in the NPR about what should be included, what could be included, what might be included going forward to meet those services needs. Touched a little bit on this earlier. Now again, a little lower down in the trees about what activities, can qualify for community development credit. We are not losing the 4 current definitions: affordable housing, community services, economic development, or revitalization and stabilization. But the ANPR had a bunch of questions like, hey, how can we make this clear? Especially revitalize, stabilize is a little bit of a hodgepodge. Like, what's a better way to explain this? What's a better way to get this applied consistently to achieve consistency? There's also in the proposal, like, hey, what if there's a mechanism to get certainty before you do something, ex ante, before the event? Hey, I'm a bank or I'm a nonprofit, I'm trying to partner with a bank, and I'd like to say, hey, this activity or this product would receive CRA credit. Is there a mechanism that I could get proof that it doesn't necessarily exist? Although honestly, like, you can always reach out to your regulator. They can usually let you know, like, hey, this looks good, or activities like this would receive CRA credit. But trying to create a formal mechanism to get CRA credit ahead of time. That's something we're thinking of. Also, creating a longer illustrative list of CD activities and what makes sense. Hey, this is an example of affordable housing. This is something that might not be affordable housing. This is something that might be affordable housing in one area, but not in another. Specifically in rural areas, and there's a slide on this, like CRA that currently exists is very broad brush, recognizing that different areas are very different in terms of opportunity and need. Specifically rural areas, it's often tougher to find opportunities to participate in community development activities or create affordable housing. They're often done on a smaller basis. So it's something that we're trying to address through the ANPR process as well. Like, hey, maybe rural areas need a little bit, a wider area to hit from. Also questions on what's going to define a rural area. Can it be census tract? Does it have to be a whole county? In the 3rd district, there are some areas that are significantly agrarian with low population centers, specifically like the northern tier of Pennsylvania. So I think there's some opportunities there. You get some mixed questions, for instance, in South Jersey, where there are lots of population centers, but largely agricultural around that. So we do recognize that, and we're trying to be addressing more areas and so forth. I did see a question pop up about the phraseology of Indian country, and recommending changing that. This language, obviously the Federal Reserve, we aim to be inclusive to everybody, and not offensive to any party, specifically any. And through the ANPR, we're trying to make it more useful, more from a CRA perspective, to partner with certain areas where there has been persistent poverty. As to the best of my knowledge, Indian country is the approved and appreciated nomenclature, but it's definitely something, if that is offensive, that is something we will look into, and obviously no offense was intended. As I mentioned a little bit before, I'll back up one. One issue question we get in the CRA space is, hey, I'm partnering with this nonprofit. I'm a bank partner with a nonprofit. Or I'm a nonprofit and I've got like a large, footprint. The bank has a small footprint, large nonprofit. Hey, can I get CRA credit if we donate to them? And generally the answer is yes. It's including your footprint, even if you can't track down exactly, hey, these dollars that you gave to the nonprofit, went back to your assessment area. It's a greater statewide regional area. We're trying to tinker with that language in the ANPR. Hey, what if it's, to a nearby state where the bank doesn't have any branches, but it's still in the same regional area, based on regional nomenclature. There's an example in the ANPR like, hey, what if it's in a different mid-Atlantic state? That's a pretty broad definition, but that's something, we're throwing out there is, could that qualify? Does that make sense? We want to make it easier for banks to get CRA credit. But we also recognize the importance of, serving your assessment area first, or at least significantly before kind of moving on. That said, there are some areas that do have persistent poverty or, despite the best interests of numerous parties throughout long periods of time, Appalachia, the Delta, the colonial areas, the border between U.S. and Mexico, where there is a very great need and a dearth of banks to meet them. So, if you are, going out of your way or you've got a pipeline into one of those areas and you as a bank are meeting those credit needs, regardless of whether or not it's inside your assessment area, there's conversation, you should probably get credit for that. Those are social goods that is helping meet the needs somewhere that badly needs it or historically needs it. So that's considered a good. That's not too far a departure from what we've currently done in certain instances. For instance, Superstorm Sandy, which hits, our region, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Harvey in the Texas area. When those popped up, if banks made loans or made community development activities in those areas, they would receive credit even if outside their assessment area. That's something we're just trying to expand to provide help where help is needed. A lot of discussion in the ANPR about how ratings are created and come about. There's some formula in there based on deposits and loans, based on ratings. So please do take a look at the ANPR and see if that approach makes more sense than what currently exists. Two things I want to tease out from this a little bit more. As it currently stands, if you've got a bank that has numerous assessment areas in one state, we will look at some what we consider full scope, and then we will look at some areas which we consider, of less impact, limited scope is what we call it. And then there's a concern that, hey, if you look at the same full scope areas and the same limited scope areas, what really happens with those limited scope areas? So the ANPR is proposing getting rid of limited scope and just looking at everything and kind of rolling it up mathematically together based on percentage of deposits and percentage of, sorry, I saw a question pop up. Todd, I'll try to get to that at the end. But percentage of deposits and percentage of loans. Additionally, there's lots of conversation in the ANPR about minority depository institutions, women-owned financial institutions, and low-income credit unions, and ways to increase bank partnership with them. And, is that something that maybe that's always going to receive credit, even if it's outside the assessment area? Or maybe it's the sort of enhancements that can help propel a rating from satisfactory to outstanding. Again, recognizing that although they don't exist in every kind of milieu, every area, every census tract in the country, it's still something that, is worth focusing on as a way to dollars here are dollars that are always appreciated. CRA is often a data challenge, honestly, for those researchers amongst us who are trying to tease data out of performance evaluations where they can relate. We also don't want to be a huge burden to banks. In an ideal world, we would get all the information we need. Banks would get all the information they need from nonprofits, and everything could proceed smoothly and add a performance evaluation. But that's A, incredibly burdensome, and B, probably unlikely. That is not the expectation of the ANPR. Instead, the hope is to provide more clarity up front for what information is needed. Hey, a template for community development activities, including investments, loans, and services. What information we need, let's get a formal process to get information to examiners and then continue from there. Additionally, there's lots of good dialogue about deposit information. As it currently stands, deposit information is tracked to bank branches. We use an FDIC report for that, the summary of deposits. But that's not necessarily where the deposits are coming from. They're coming from, individual areas and often, lower moderate income areas. And, examiners don't have the information. Banks may or may not have access to the location of their depositors. And again, it's like, how burdensome would it be to get that information? The ANPR wants to know, and I want to know personally too, like what sort of information is available here? Is the expectation that all banks would have to start collecting this data? Like, no. Like right now, the ANPR is saying, if you're a small bank, don't worry about keeping that. If you're a large bank, what kind of makes sense? What do you have? And then there will obviously be some privacy concerns. What would the examiner receive versus what would actually make into the PE? But just any other way to kind of get more granular information on deposit information. That's just an area that there's, ripe for improvement, because tracking to deposits, tracking to branches isn't the best. I mentioned this a little earlier, like rural areas, we're trying to tailor unique circumstances a little bit better. So trying to figure out, maybe if you do certain services in a rural area, they would count, whereas they might not count in other areas. It's just a recognition that this has been a shortcoming of current CRA and, something that needs to be addressed. That's the fourth I'm mentioning, the comment period, wrapping up, at least this date is correct, 2021. Please do provide comments. The ANPR, I will admit, is a little bit of a daunting document. There are 99 proposed questions. You do not have to respond to all 99 proposed questions. If you've got, good thoughts on a handful of questions, throw those out there. If you've got thoughts on all 99 questions, power to you. We'd love to hear all those too. Again, I can guarantee every single comment will be read probably by numerous people. Good ideas that are data-driven will be, followed up on and given as much thought as we can throw to it. And, if there's information we can glean, we will do our best. We want this to be a collaborative process, as collaborative as possible. So I'm sure you've got some ideas, so please do comment. We would appreciate that. Email, fax, even mail. So with that, Samantha, I'm going to turn it over. I know there were a couple questions that came up. And if there are any more, things I didn't cover, things you heard, things you thought you heard, things you thought you knew, feel free to ask those as well. Otherwise, Samantha, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Micah. We are really grateful. We did get a few questions that I want to just share with you for feedback for everyone. The first question comes in from, it looks like Commissioner Mark Higgins. In that metro area, they do not have a bank branch or a single bank headquarters in the area. Can you please use CRA Reinvestment Update to strengthen financial institution investments where their branches and customers are located, not just their headquartered communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the ANPR is kind of covering that in two, maybe three ways that occur to me. Unfortunately, we can't force banks to, hey, you have to go into this area, but we can incentivize them. There's a lot of discussion about CRA deserts, areas where there might not be bank branches, and if a bank is, an only one or like one of the only branches in that area, they should receive kind of, an increased, CRA credit and incentive there to operate and making operations in there. Another way, and this is something we hear from the banker side, it's, again, there's no branches there, but they're using our apps. They might not be a smartphone. And while I obviously recognize that not everyone has a smartphone, not everyone honestly has like decent Wi-Fi depending on where you are. So, but if there's information that can prove, hey, although there's no branches, we've got all this information about, loans and deposit activity happening in that area, that's something, the ANPR and changes to CRA and CRA modernization would hopefully impact and bring to light.
Thank you. We have another question regarding financial inclusion. Are individuals with disabilities included in this section fostering greater financial inclusion, and perhaps accessing capital for assistive technology, including housing, vehicles, adaptation, etc.?
You know, that's a great question. As it currently stands, the Community Reinvestment Act is largely based on income classification. Race isn't discussed. Disability prohibited bases are not necessarily discussed. However, like I do know, from my own research, that a significant percentage of those with disabilities are often low and moderate income, just due to circumstances and abilities. So often participation with groups, Liberty comes to mind in Philadelphia, that is a large a nonprofit centered on aiding those with disabilities. It can receive CRA credit. It's not necessarily a guarantee. However, it's a CDFI, which I think some do focus on areas such as disability, that could receive CRA credit that way. So while there's been no expansion into expectations to meet meet the needs of those with disabilities, there are ways that CRA does apply in that space. It's also worth mentioning that in some of the comments I've already seen related to if a bank has significant illegal credit practices or consumer compliance violations, that can negatively impact their CRA rating. And there were there's a non-illustrative list of regs that can be impacted currently. Anyway, one of the proposals said, hey, what about the violation of ADA, the American with Disabilities Act? Like, could that result in a downgrade of CRA performance? So I think that was like a thoughtful comment. So in this space, there is much more to do in the inclusive space. I don't necessarily think the ANPR has gone that way yet, but I think if you've got comments in that area, that this is a good venue to raise them.
Our next question is related to, would SBA PPP loans be available for CRA credit? And if so, how would these be reported?
Great question. And I'm going to answer that question like two different ways, one of which I'm going to back up and raise something that's in the ANPR that is related to this. Since 1995, we have defined small business loans as a loan for $1 million or less. Easy joke, $1 million doesn't go as far as it used to, and that hasn't been increased since 1995. So should that threshold go up? Should the definition of a small business loan be increased? With inflation, it will go up to about 1.6. Should it be $2 million? It's a round number. Obvious downside to this is that's a call report definition, which something banks use, which is something researchers use, which is something like, it's a clean definition, it's a clean number as opposed to adjusting it to inflation. So that is what the ANPR is asking about. Hey, should we raise that $1 million number? Why did I bring this up? Because the current PPP loan amounts, the way it functions is you should report it if it's less than $1 million as a small business loan. Again, theoretically, if it went up and there's another round of PPP, it could be increased and so forth. But generally, currently, that's the way it should be reported. If it is greater than $1 million, it should also be reported on your call report, but under a different section, still a small business loan. But from a CRA perspective, and there's a CA letter out, public CA letter about this, you can receive community development credit for those loans larger than $1 million that, go to either economic development or help revitalize stabilized geographies. So, yeah, that's more of a current question because I guess the PPP loans are kind of on the books now, and ANPR is not final, but hopefully that's helped. But again, there is a public CA letter that helps address questions about PPP and community development activity.
Thank you, Micah. We have one more question. Someone is seeking Todd Zartman is looking for, what is the definition of an economically distressed area? Been asked before, but wanted to clarify.
Yeah, Todd, that's a great question. And there's a certain percentage of persistent poverty that exists currently. It's got to be below, it's like the median family income is below a certain percent of standards. And I apologize, I don't know offhand. I want to say it's 25%, but don't hold me to that. Below median family income. That tends to be distressed or impoverished areas. There is discussion in the ANPR about expanding that definition or, honing in on those areas historically, honing into those areas that have been historically distressed or impoverished. But generally, yeah, there's a current definition, and I apologize, I don't know it offhand.
Thank you. We have another question, it looks like from Mayor Michael Nutter. How would you rate the impact of CRA on lowering poverty in America and more directly, positively impacting the lives of Black and Brown people?
Well, thank you for that question. The current impact, I wish I could say CRA has been a boon and everything is sunshine and roses and everyone's equal and happy. That is not the case. I wish it were. CRA is part of the, regulatory framework helping address income inequality and discrimination. It goes hand in hand with the Federal Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. It is parts of that. These issues obviously still exist. Again, wish they didn't. But it's also, there's not one quick regulatory fix, change this, and discrimination goes away, and, credit needs and housing values equalize. Again, I wish it was. I do think CRA has done a good job highlighting these areas. It creates requirements to banks to meet low and moderate income, meet the credit needs in low and moderate income areas. As I mentioned earlier, CRA does highlight on income classification as opposed to percentage of minority in the area. Those are more in the fair lending space. But I will say in Philadelphia specifically, as well as the surrounding counties, there is a very high correlation between what are low and moderate income and what are majority and minority census tracts, which I think goes to show that, there is much more improvement that needs to be done. And one of the hopes of this ANPR is to help shine more light on those areas, to help banks know that this area needs help community groups know that this is an area of focus. So again, I think there's hope in this area. And that's kind of the goal of the ANPR right now. But thank you for that question.
All right, our next question is asking, will IBBEA be revised, including how rated areas will be configured? And that question comes from Scott Korber.
Thanks. The Interstate Bank, I forget, it's a 109 Regal Neal Sunshine Act. I'm looking kind of at how activities in other states where a bank is headquartered, is that going to change? That's currently not proposed in the ANPR. That's kind of 109 of the Regal Neal Act is not being impacted. And for broader purposes, it basically looks at, hey, the bank taking deposits out of a state, but not lending back in that state in a significant way. I think one driver of this that's going to be impacted is if we get better information onto where the depositors actually are, I think that will help us do a better job of knowing how well a bank is, actually taking money out of an area, as opposed to, hey, we attributed all of these deposits to this one branch. Like, is everyone actually in that state? So I think it's not directly impacted, but it's significantly indirectly impacted.
Thank you. We have another question from, it looks like, Salika Johnson. Can you explain CRA valuation regarding the HERA program, HERA program? It looks like for details, banks are evaluated in 5 categories: affordable housing, health facilities, job creation, disaster, and HERA.
And I apologize, I don't know about the HERA program. Is that kind of in the hospital public health space? Sorry, to ask a follow-up question to that.
I'll see if we can get a follow-up question to
is that
our
like the public health needs assessment kind of thing? Yeah.
No, I see a no for that one. She says no, so.
Then I apologize. It's not something I'm familiar with.
Okay. We will see if we can address that via our follow-up. One final question is, how will PPP loans made outside assessment areas affect CRA rating?
Hey, Joe. That's a question. So I'm trying to think, because there's 2 ways. On the CD side, if they're larger than $1 million and outside the assessment area, and in probably an LMI geography or in a way we can qualify as being, helping economic development, we will qualify it. We're not blanket qualifying all of them just because they're outside. But there will be CD credit given in that area when we can point to, like, hey, this is helping, this is tied to low moderate income borrowers or lower moderate income geographies.
Great. It looks like those are all the questions we have thus far. So with that, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. And we really appreciate all of the questions. We appreciate your attendance. Thank you to Micah and to Anjanette for providing us with great information today. The information shared today about the advance notice of proposed rulemaking will be made available on our website as well as in the follow-up materials. We'll also have information about how you can submit your public comment, and that'll be provided. So please do feel free to submit your comment by February 16th, 2021. And with that, we want to thank you all for joining us today.